Alrighty, friends, we are about to begin our new story, Action Jackson. But before we do, I want to quickly spend some time talking about topic versus main idea. We have talked about what the main topic is before, so I want to review what the difference between a topic and a main idea is, so when we get to our exit ticket, we all understand the difference. So if you'll follow along with the red dot, we know that the topic is the big idea or subject that the author writes about. The ways that you can find the topic are the ways that you can describe and talk about the topic. You should be able to say the topic in 1 or 2 words. We are already doing this with our gist. When I ask you guys for the gist and I ask you what the topic is always going to be who or what the text is about, which we can always say in 1 or 2 words. We want to know what the general subject is, which means that it's about what the whole text is about. It's not about one teeny tiny part, it's about that holistic view that we've talked about before. The whole text, not just parts of it, but what all of it is about. So 1 or 2 words about the whole text, and you can usually find some clues in the title. Again, your topic is who or what it's about, but it should only be 1 or 2 words. Now, if we look over on this side and think about what's the main idea, the main idea is a statement the author makes about the topic. So you need to know what the topic is in order to know what the main idea is, and we will practice that today. So the main idea is something that can be confusing, which is why we're reviewing together, is that it says right here, how you guys see on the chart, the main idea is also what the text is mostly about. And you might be thinking about, well, isn't the topic what the text is mostly about? Yes, it is. However, one way that the topic and the main idea are different is that the main idea can be explained in a sentence. It's more than just your who or what in 1 or 2 words. It's a sentence that explains a more specific part. It's not about necessarily always about the whole text. We can have different main ideas on different sections or paragraphs of the story, and we look for details in the text, which means that we can't just look at the title. So take a second to look back and forth between the topic versus main idea. And now that you've had a chance to hear me explain it, what do you notice that's different? Take a minute to read this first box under topic, and then read the big box under main idea. What do you notice that's the same? And what do you notice that's different? Just from looking at the chart and reviewing, I can see that the main idea is different because it's a statement. And I know looking here at this next box that the topic is going to be only 1 or 2 words. I can check again and I see here, oh, the main idea can be a sentence. I can also look for clues in the topic. I can also look for clues in the title to find the topic, but I need to look for details in the text to make sure I know what the main idea is. So for example, if we're reading this book about plants, looking at the title, I already know that the topic in 1 or 2 words is going to be about plants. That tells me what the text is about. However, for the main idea, I want to know more specifically, what does the author want me to know about plants? So I can't just rely on the title. I need to look at the text, and I see, like it's circled in pink, that the main idea is that plants need 4 things to live. In order to find out what the 4 things are, I'm going to keep reading. But the main idea, the big idea about the text, is that all of this is going to be about those 4 things that the plants need to live. That's what the author wants me to learn. That's going to be the main idea because it's more specific than the topic. We will practice that together, but this is just an example of how the topic and the main idea are different. When we've talked about the main topic before, we also want to make sure that we are still using supporting details, just like we're going to do, this should say main idea. The main idea is going to be supported by details, just like we see in this picture down here with the stool. The main idea is the big idea, and it needs to be supported just like this stool or chair with details. We're going to find supporting details for the main idea using these steps in the text, but first we're going to start with our new story. Also in our story, we're going to have new words like gesture or original. And I really want you guys to think about how can I plug it back into the text to find the meaning. But without further ado, today we are going to be reading Action Jackson by Jan Greenberg and Sandra Jordan and illustrated by Robert Andrew Parker. If you see Miss Papa looking down, it's just because I'm reading my book because sometimes the words are hard to see on the screen. Your thinking job while you listen to me read aloud is to think. What is the text mostly about? I want you guys to start thinking about what is the main idea? What does the author want me to know about this page or this story? In the afternoon, Jackson Pollock puts on his paint-splattered boots and walks across the yard. So from that first page, we already know that this is a real detail, that Jackson Pollock wore boots to paint and they got paint all over them. The wind blows in from Gardiner's Bay, bringing the scent of salt marshes and sea lavender. His eyes miss nothing. Sunlight on the tree branches, tangled stalks of blackberry bushes, beetles crawling in the grass underfoot. All of these help us imagine. They help us visualize the setting. Words like the sea marshes and the sea lavender. Those help us visualize what that setting smells like. Imagine being outside and smelling the salt or the lavender from the ocean. His eyes miss nothing because there's sunlight and tree branches, and he even notices the beetles crawling around under him. So he's watching and smelling where he is. Caw, caw! The crow flies down and lands on his shoulder. So this might be an example of something that the author is using their imagination for. We don't know if a crow actually landed on Jackson Pollock's shoulder, but this is part of the author being creative using their imagination. We can also, as readers, visualize. We know what sound the crow made when we see in a text that says, caw, caw, and right after it says, the crow. So we know that caw, caw is a sound that the crow makes that we can visualize with the words. Caw, caw, the crow he tamed flies down and lands on his shoulder. His border collie, Jip, runs in circles, demanding a walk across the fields and down a country to the wide, sandy beach. But Jackson turns and keeps going. We will see some pages in this text, for example, like this one, that don't have any words. But we want to think about, why is this illustration important? What do we already see Jackson doing in this illustration that's different, or that the author is going to want us to know? Do painters usually stand on their canvas where they're going to paint? No. So let's read more to see, why is he already standing on where he's going to paint? The gray weathered barn used to be filled with rustic machinery, old fishing gear, and broken tools. Now it's his art studio, a place for painting. So when we see the word studio again, we know that's going to be a place where Jackson paints. Some artists put a canvas on an easel or hang it on a wall. Not Jackson. He spreads his out like a sheet, smoothing it flat with his large hands. He wants his paintings to be big, big as the sky out west where he grew up, flat as the marshland behind his house. So the author wants us to think about the sky out west and the flat marshland, because that helps us to visualize why he's putting that canvas on the floor. Sunlight pokes through the cracks in the boards and flies buzz in the dusty studio air. Sliding doors rattle on their frames. He sits silent on the floor, staring at the blank canvas. Some artists cover the canvas with a base coat of white paint. Not Jackson. He wants the paint to soak into the surface, leaving bare patches peeking through the stains of color. Some painters use oil paint or watercolor. Not Jackson. He'll use ordinary house paint from the hardware store to make his painting. Some artists paint pictures of flowers or people or landscapes. Not Jackson. He expresses his thoughts and feelings directly on the canvas, calling it energy and motion made visible. And still he sits, surrounded by the cans of enamel, brushes, stiff with dried paint, knives, sticks, a spatula, and canvases, waiting. So I want to take a second to also talk about some things on this page. In these first couple paragraphs right here, you guys heard me read over and over the words, not Jackson. Why does the author keep repeating the words, not Jackson? Some artists cover where they're going to paint with a white base coat, but not him. He wants the colors to soak in. Some painters use watercolors, just like you guys have with Miss Via, but not Jackson. He uses that thick, sticky paint from the hardware store. So we already know that the author is giving us clues that Jackson is different from other painters. And this page tells us how. It tells us that how he doesn't want to use that coat of white paint. Not Jackson. He wants the paint to stick, leaving bare just those little tiny spots between where he's going to splatter. Some painters use oil or watercolor. Not Jackson. He uses that paint from the hardware store. So he also doesn't have regular ideas. A lot of artists will paint people or landscapes. Landscapes is like when you look outside and you see the ocean or trees. It tells us about the land, which is why it's called a landscape. But not Jackson. That's not what he's going to paint. He wants to express his thoughts and feelings. He wants to make the energy that he feels inside of him visible. When we think about motion and the way that the trees breathe, or the trees move in the sway in the wind, or the way that a soccer player runs across the field, both of those things are motion, and both of those things have lots of energy. That's not something that we can see. So Jackson wants to use his paintings to make that energy and motion visible. So there's already 3 ways that Jackson is different than other painters. Take a second to think. Why does the author keep repeating the words not Jackson? How did we learn that Jackson is different than other painters? As you guys think about that, we're going to keep reading and learning on this next page. Here we have another example of a page that doesn't have any text, only illustrations. This page goes along with what we just read before. We already see how he's got those buckets of paint from the hardware store and how there's no base coat in white. So we already know that this illustration shows us the words that we read. Here we have another illustration, and we see that Jackson is wearing those paint boots still, and it looks like he's standing over his painting. At last he stands. He chooses a stick and dips it into a can of syrupy paint. Slowly, he circles the canvas, stepping around the edges, straddling the corners. Black lines form a tangled web. Now he chooses a brush, working toward the middle. Sprays of color, tan, teal, yellow, and white. An athlete with a paintbrush. He uses his whole body to make the painting. Layers build with each gesture. New colors emerging, blending, and disappearing into the wet surface. He swoops and leaps like a dancer, paint trailing from a brush that doesn't touch the canvas. I want to make a longer and longer line. I want it to keep going. So we also have some important things that we can talk about on this page. We know that he is circling around that canvas and he's making these black lines that we see in the illustration. He wants to make those lines longer and longer. And the way that he does that is he uses his whole body for the painting. He's not a regular painter. He's not just sitting down with his paintbrush, only using his hand. He's using his whole body, just like an athlete. An athlete is anyone who plays sports. So if we think about football players or soccer players, they use their whole body to move the ball around. Jackson is like an athlete because he uses his whole body to move that paintbrush around, to paint all over that big, big canvas. So the author wants us to visualize how an athlete to help the reader understand how Jackson is using his body to paint. We know that if he's moving his body, that he's making gestures. The way that he leaps and dances around the canvas are types of gestures. They're movements that he makes with his body, and those movements help him to paint. If we keep reading on the next page, hours go by like minutes. Suddenly, he feels exhausted. used up, his inspiration gone. Things get in the way of the flow, like roots blocking a soil line. He puts down the brush and goes into the house to help make supper, his mind filled with thoughts about the wet painting back on the studio floor. So on this page, we want to think about hours go by like minutes. Hours are a long time. There's 60 minutes in 1 hour. So if the whole hour feels like a minute, that means time is going by quickly. And then suddenly, or all at once, he feels tired because he has spent so much time painting that now all of a sudden his idea is gone. So he has to take a break and come back to it later. So he takes a break to go inside, but while he's inside, he's still thinking about his painting. Here we see him inside with what we will learn later is his wife, and he's taking a break from his painting to cook. We know that while he's cooking, he's looking down and smiling because he's still thinking about that idea he had in his studio. And now we're going to finish the rest of the story later, but now we're going to take some time to think about what is the main idea of the story that we've read so far, and how can we prove it by finding supporting details. We're going to look at some pages together, and we're going to look at some examples, and I want you guys to really think about what is the main idea and what are some supporting details that can show what we know.